Welcome back, SEVillage, here at DEF CON. I hope you're excited. I can see a bunch of you in the chat, as I am. I am really excited about our speaking track today, like I was yesterday, but today no one got sick and there's no problem, so we'll be all together for the next few hours, enjoying some of this awesome content that we have ready for all of you folks here. Okay, a couple housekeeping notes as before. Comments are shut off here on the Twitch channel, so add all your questions and comments into the Discord. I'll be collecting all the questions during the speech, and then after at the end, we'll make sure that Lisa addresses any questions that you have. Keep it clean, keep it nice, like you did yesterday, and everything will be great. Okay, now let's talk about Lisa. So we've been friends probably for, boy, I'm thinking it's got to be longer than 5 years, maybe going on 5 or 6 years. And I met Lisa in the UK. I go there to train, and we just had a similar mindset about social engineering, especially the motto of leaving people feeling better for having met you, and our ethics and morals lined up. And we became instant friends. And I got to hear some crazy things about Lisa's career and helping stop Somalian pirates, counter espionage. I mean, there's just, it's like her life is a movie. And then she entered into the social engineering world, started a company which oddly is named Red Goat. Maybe she'll tell you the story about that. I'm not really sure. And now she's one of the leading women in social engineering here globally. And we are pleased to have her giving a speech all about using social engineering to create insider threats and win all the things. So Lisa, I cannot wait to hear this speech. Thank you for joining us, and have a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, and thanks for that introduction. Personally, don't think my life is like a movie, but there we go. It's also pouring with rain here, so if you hear rain, it is not an interesting water feature that I have. It's just, that's what it is. It's rain on the windows. So yeah, I'm Lisa Forte, and as Chris has mentioned, Red Goat, which is my company, and the story behind it, then I ought to just tell it. So when I formed the company, I couldn't figure out what to call it, and I wanted red to be in it because at the time we were really interested in red teaming, and I couldn't think of anything else to add to that was unique. And at the time we were sort of back and forthing names, and I was reading a scientific magazine called The New Scientist, and in it there was an article about how goats can identify intruders into their herds by hearing just their voice. And I thought, that's exactly what social engineering and social engineering training is aiming to do. So Red Goat was born out of that. And it's a unique name, so it works quite well. But today we're here to talk about how social engineering can be used to actually turn loyal employees, essentially, within a company into insider threats. So I want to kick off by talking about Lucy. So this is Lucy. Lucy is a young employee of a company that operates in the extractive industry. The company, who we'll call Mortal for the purposes of this talk, they operate in the extractive industry, so sort of oil and gas, that kind of thing. She's young, she's fairly idealistic probably. Her reports from her managers were always, she was super enthusiastic, getting involved in all the stuff that work had to offer, always going above and beyond for all the projects that she was involved in. And yeah, she was the model employee, if you could have a model employee. And this was her first sort of real job, because she'd finished university in the UK, and she'd gone traveling in South America, and she'd spent a year or so there learning Spanish, and she became very heavily into sort of conservation work and that kind of thing, then came back to the UK and started this job. So why am I talking about Lucy? Well, Lucy one day found that she had a friend request, and the friend request was from a similarly aged young lady who said that she worked for the same company as Lucy, Nina. And Nina said, I work for the same company as you, but I work in the Lima office in Peru. And, we've got lots in common. I'd like to get to know you. I'm practicing my English. It would be brilliant if we could just sort of connect and become, friends and chat. And they did. They were both sort of similarly aged, intelligent young ladies. And they became really, really good friends. And they started chatting on Facebook and exchanging mobile phone or cell phone numbers. and became really close. And then a crisis was presented to Lucy. And this crisis came from Nina, and she said to her that in Peru, there'd been all of these newspaper articles that had been alleging that the company that they worked for, Mortil, had been doing sort of underhand things in the Peruvian jungle. So leaving oil everywhere, you know, causing sort of distress and illness to the locals and things like this. And she said it's, you know, been a really big thing in Peru. It's been horrific. And she claimed that, you know, she didn't really believe it. But she alleged to Lucy that she'd attended a meeting with some of the executives. And in this meeting, the executives had basically said, this was the plan all along. It's cheaper to do it this way. We don't care about the lives of these individuals. So she presented this to Lucy and she said, you know, I'm going to quit the company. I can't work for something like this anymore. And cleverly, Nina got Lucy to actually talk her out of leaving the company. And instead, Lucy said, no, look, we've got to do something about this. Let's do something about this together. Let's take some action. So Nina has a very convenient, beautifully planned out idea, all ready to go conveniently. And she knows a gentleman who is a journalist, and his name is Rob. And Rob is apparently a journalist who's worked on sort of exposing corporate scandals, governmental corruption, WikiLeaks, all of that kind of sphere of journalism, investigative, hard-hitting journalism. And apparently Rob also lives in Peru. He's apparently an American journalist living in Peru with his wife, and there's this whole story about them and how they've moved to Peru and why. And they start a chat. And Lucy, Nina, and Rob start chatting in this WhatsApp group. And funnily enough, Rob can help these two young ladies expose this company's wrongdoing and human rights violations and everything else that they're doing. But he says, look, in order to do this, I can't just allege this. I'm going to need some evidence. So I'm going to need you guys to go and collect the evidence for me because you both work for the company. So that makes sense, right? So for 14 months, so well over a year, these three individuals talk on WhatsApp, and Rob instructs Lucy and Nina with what documents he wants them to go and photograph on their phones and take on their phones. So this happens and it goes on, and Lucy said that actually some of the documents were a bit strange. It was a bit of an odd thing to ask for from the perspective of, you know, exposing Peruvian human rights violations or whatever. So she thought it was a bit strange. It turns out, funnily enough, Nina does not exist and Rob does not exist. Both of these characters were created in order to talk to Lucy, build rapport with Lucy, socially engineer Lucy to steal a bunch of documents that would have had nothing whatsoever to do with the Peruvian jungle, but have a lot to do with some R&D that was going on within the company. And there's some very clever constructions here. For example, Nina was a very, very, very cleverly constructed character. They knew that Lucy had been in the Peruvian jungle and she'd been, you know, in South America doing this volunteering. So they created a character that lived in South America, about the same age, female, similar interests. It was also quite convenient because Rob was the authority figure. Rob was the person who was issuing what he wanted them to go and collect. He was telling them the instructions. So he was the authority figure in this relationship. But Nina then would go and comply with whatever Rob said. So if he said, right, I need you to all go and steal this, this, and this. And Nina says, yeah, that's no problem. I'll do it. We've got a nice set of social proof here because now Lucy looks at Nina, who is complying and who is her friend, and now thinks it's okay for her to go and do the same thing. So Lucy this loyal employee, this idealistic, nice, hardworking individual, ended up becoming an insider threat, not out of malice necessarily or disgruntlement towards her employer, because she was socially engineered and believed a story that just simply wasn't true. So what are insider threats? Because we hear this term thrown around a lot in our industry, and there's a lot of confusing terminology. There's a lot of confusing individuals and case studies. So, you hear people say, okay, well, it's, is it Snowden? Is it Bradley Manning? Is it Nick Leeson? We hear terms thrown around like disgruntlement and, bad apples and whistleblower, criminal, all of these sorts of things. We also hear accidental insider or innocent insider. So the whole sort of landscape of it is very confused, and there's a lot of misunderstandings about what is and isn't an insider threat. So broadly, the conventional understanding, according to US CERT, but also legal institutions as well, is that it broadly breaks down into two categories. And this talk, we're talking about intentional, but I'll just quickly touch on the unintentional for the sake of completeness. So unintentional, people who do not intend harm to the company. So this may very well be a mistake. It could be negligence. So they should have known that they were about to take a risk, but they didn't. Or it could be reckless. They knew they were taking a risk, but they didn't intend harm to come from it. They thought they'd get away with the risk. That's very different to intentional insiders. And I think there's a tendency as well for us to start talking about malicious and disgruntled. And that's not correct, because intentional insiders are people who intend to cause harm to your organization. That there is an intent to steal something or sabotage something. That doesn't necessarily come out of disgruntlement, though. Sometimes that can be other motivations, financially motivated. It doesn't necessarily mean they dislike their employer. So intentional insiders, there are three different types of attack that you see happen. There is theft, which is obviously the case in the example I gave of Lucy. We have sabotage and we have fraud. And those are the three identifiable types of attack that we see from insiders, just purely given their exposure, I suppose. Now, I should say that the discussion on social media over the last couple of days, I'm obsessed with space. You can see on this side, there's a Soyuz rocket hanging on my wall, and this is also a Soyuz rocket on my poster, on my slides. And someone suggested that everyone at home has to do a shot every time I bring up a space reference. So this is shot number one for everybody who is actually abiding by that rule. So why are insiders so valuable? Well, the space sector is actually a really good one to look at here, because typically in the space race, I suppose, between the Soviet Union, Russia, and the United States, there was a lot of espionage going on between those two nations, because it was a highly innovative time. They were creating sort of R&D and new engineering techniques continuously. And to keep on top of it, they needed to steal each other's secrets, right? They wanted to, at the very least, know what the other one was up to and how much progress they were making in this space race. Now, in the space sector, we see even more innovation with SpaceX and Blue Origin, private companies who are taking to this as well. So it's a great industry to look at, because typically the industries that see insider threats manifest are the ones that have high rates of innovation, high rates of R&D and intellectual property generation. So the space sector is a classic one, pharmaceuticals are another one, tech is another one, obviously, and so on and so forth. So imagine that you wanted to compromise a satellite company. And this satellite company has satellites that orbit the Earth, and most satellites will pass around the Earth at a faster speed than the Earth is spinning. So in order to capture the data from those satellites, they have ground stations positioned around the globe. And these ground stations can be in really obscure positions. They can be basically anywhere, with a small number of staff who probably know exactly where they are and can access them. So instead of you sitting at home trying to break into these ground stations and intercept this SATCOM transmission. It actually could be better to find these staff that have access and get them to do it for you. And that way you can position yourself in a great position without any chance really of being detected at all. And this is what's happened in this particular case. So ECDIS, some of you may have heard of this. So ECDIS is the electronic chart display information system, I think it translates as. It's essentially put on board ships, and all modern ships will have it, and it is like the navigation system, basically. It helps the ship know where it's going, a bit like a GPS, but a bit more involved. And I was doing some insider threat research, actually, and one of the participants in the study was a seafarer. And he said that one day he was on a ship on a voyage, and he went up to the bridge, and on the bridge was one other gentleman, a colleague, I suppose, who was sort of fiddling with the ECDIS computer and trying to plug something in, and it wouldn't quite go in, and it was making a bit of a mess. And he questioned him, and he said, you know, what are you doing? What's going on? What are you trying to fix? And the gentleman was sort of all flustered and clearly been caught doing something he shouldn't have been doing. And so the guy sort of questioned him a bit more, and he said, well, look, I'll be completely honest. A businessman paid me a fair amount of money to take this USB device and plug it into this ECDIS computer. And look, if you don't tell anybody, I'll give you half the money. And obviously probably quite taken aback by this statement, the gentleman who participated in my research claimed that he didn't take the money. I can't verify whether he did or not. But you have to ask the question, why would a businessman pay a seafarer a large amount of money to plug a USB device in that did nothing? That doesn't make any sense. That device did not do nothing. But yet, this was easier than other ways. So whatever the intent behind that device was, it was easier to speak to one of the seafarers on board and get them to do it than it was to do it from an outsider's perspective. So how do we go about creating our insider threat as social engineers? What does that process look like? Because we're going to have some concerns, right? There's going to be a little bit of risk, not a lot involved. More so, they might say no. They might just block us on social media. They might report us. They might start the process and then be terrible at it. They might, report things. Who knows what will happen? You're entering a realm where you're dealing with human beings. There's a lot of unknowns that could go on. So we have to sort of look at it a little bit like we'd look at any attack, really. So if we look at a kill chain for this, you'd start with reconnaissance. And reconnaissance is pretty much how you would go about in any social engineering engagement, right? It's pretty much the same, but you're going to be looking at targets who have got ideally access to commercially sensitive information, things like I said, R&D, intellectual property, also maybe business plans, things that are going to be commercially sensitive would be very, very useful and valuable. And then you're going to look at them from the perspective like you would any social engineering engagement. Are they online? Is there lots of information about them? Can I tell a bit about their personality? That kind of thing. And that's obviously really, really important. Now, where it differs from your average social engineering engagement, your phishing call or even a spearphishing email, is this next stage, the first contact. So what you've got to remember is in this process, it's a much, much longer winded process. It's not sort of, I always say quick and dirty. It's not quick and dirty like some of the other social engineering attacks. It's going to go on probably for months and months, possibly even years. So this first contact is really crucial and needs to be really light touch. So on a vision call, perhaps you would call up and you would need to start getting information quite quickly into that call, because you're not going to be able to call back every day for the next 4 weeks building on that information. But the key here is start very, very slow, very, very subtle. I just want to be friends. Absolutely no consequence. I'm not asking you for anything. It's seemingly to the victim, it's a very low risk engagement. And that's what's really, really interesting about these cases. The next stage is building rapport. And this I always describe to people as, you want to leave the person feeling warm and fuzzy for having met you. Okay, you want them to feel like you're an amazing person, you're someone who they can trust, they really like, someone who, you know, it is very likable to them, and they have that kind of that rapport built up with them. But one thing that we have to make sure of is that we can often feel we've built rapport with someone, but maybe they're actually a little bit suspicious and cautious of us. So we have to test that rapport first before the big ask, before we ask them to go and execute whatever we want them to do. And this is quite a crucial point, because often they will test these people with something seemingly inconsequential that's usually some sort of reveal about themselves, like a personal address or some sort of really personal information, something like that. But what the idea is just want to check that you've bought into me as much as I think you've bought into me. Then we ask them what we want them to do, what we want them to steal. Obviously, we do this without telling them the real reason, because again, if you said to Lucy, well, you know, we want to steal this information from your company, will you help us do that? Probably that's not going to have worked. So, and I'll talk a bit about this in a minute, there are lots of different ways we can persuade people to do it without actually revealing the truth. And then the final one is to extract yourself from the engagement or the attack. And the interesting thing about this stage is that often they actually leave it open a little bit like a back door, because what they want to do is they don't want to get the person into trouble. They definitely don't want to get that person fired. You've put months and months of work and rapport building into this individual. You don't want to get them fired because they're a useful asset to come back to, right? So they often leave them in place and sort of touch base with them every now and again, just so that if you want to go back and get more information, you've already got that person reasonably primed and ready to go. So I had this said to me. Someone claimed in my research that they'd been told that, yeah, just take a few photos on your phone, I won't say it was you. And this was the excuse that the attacker had given these people. And it's interesting because one thing that I realized in my research was that people do not see taking photos of company documents as stealing. In fact, it's really strange because you're not physically removing that document or that asset from the company and depriving the company of it permanently. They see it as, well, I've just taken a copy, and that's not really stealing because they've still got it. And this kind of mixed attitude, I think, to stealing something versus copying something leads people into really difficult situations, because again, it doesn't sound that bad once they've built rapport. They're not asking them to steal a computer or a load of money from a cash register. They're asking them to take a photograph on their phone, something we're all really desensitized to and should be fine with. So these sorts of things all play into why it works so well. And people believe, I think in cybersecurity generally, we focus very, very heavily on personally identifiable information, credit card information, this kind of stuff, and protecting that, which is undoubtedly important. But in this context, very, very rarely do they go after that information. In almost all the cases of insider theft, it has been intellectual property, R&D, business plans, commercially sensitive information, pretty much solely, because I think it's more saleable. It's got a market to sell it without it being necessarily hugely toxic. Like, you know, you couldn't approach a competitor and say, well, look, we stole all the credit card details from your competitor. Do you want to buy them? That's probably not going to get a good response. So whereas if you say, well, look, we've got this is what they're planning for their new product, that might actually be a bit more tempting. So I spoke earlier about the kill chain, about how we had to have sort of a story, how we had to persuade these people to do something that is pretty nefarious, really, when you strip all the stories away from it and you kind of break it down to what it really is. And generally, when you look at like how a lot of the insider world works, there's a lot of literature based on espionage, because obviously that's a very established industry of this kind of behavior. There's some on corporate espionage as well. And for the most part, you'll see these two terms thrown around, using either mice or rascals, as they call them. And I'll go through both of those in turn. And this is just basically how we can persuade people and bring people around to doing what we want them to do, that's sort of manipulative and definitely, you know, not what they think they're doing. So mice is the older of the two methodologies, and essentially it breaks down into money, fairly simplistic, ideology. So a bit like with the Lucy story, you know, they very much played on this desire to sort of be a bit of an activist, environmentalist, conservationist, that kind of thing. That was quite strong. People also can use coercion, which is typically cited as the weaker of the four to use, because and I know Chris has spoken on this before as well, that, you know, we want to create the strongest way to get someone to do something is to create a positive rapport with that individual. If you coerce someone, if you blackmail someone, you might initially get them to do what you want them to do, but what will happen is I will want to see the back of you as quickly as possible. I definitely will not like you. I definitely don't want to do you a favor or help you out or forgive any of your mistakes. And so that makes it quite a weak hold on someone, despite what you might think. It's actually far more powerful for them to like you than it is for them to dislike you. And the final one is ego or excitement, which a lot of people go for as well. And I think Lucy probably did a little bit as well. You know, I think there was probably part of Lucy that thought this was a bit exciting, a bit whistleblowery, you know, a bit activisty. And I think that probably played a big part into it. And then we've got rascals, which some of you will recognize are those 6 principles of persuasion from Cialdini. And again, they successfully used some of these in the Lucy story. Obviously, they had authority. Rob, the journalist, who was super senior journalist, had loads of experience in this space. They used Nina for the sort of social proof, you know, look, Nina's doing it, she's fine with it. They used consistency a lot as well, because they would get Lucy to do small things and then build it up and build it up and build it up. So she started to see that she was saying yes to more and more things. They built characters who Lucy was clearly going to get on really well with, like, etc. And so they used a lot of these principles. And so by weaving these into the story, you have a much, much more powerful, persuasive force behind you to get these people to do something that, let's be honest, all of us sitting here, hopefully all of us sitting here, would never dream of doing to our employer. But if the situation was right, as I'm sure Lucy would have said, maybe we would. And the sort of process is really interesting. So I worked in counter-terrorism policing in the UK. And one thing that struck me was the process of radicalization. And this was done by ISIS, who, well, they don't need any introduction. I'm sure we've all heard of ISIS. What was amazing was that through a very similar process to how I've described here, they could get young kids in the UK to pack their bags, leave their homes, their family, their school, their friends, their environment, get on a flight to Turkey, then get from Turkey to Syrian border, cross the border into Syria, and join a terrorist organization. And when you think of it like that, that sounds insane. It sounds insane that you can persuade somebody to do that. But it's done in such a beautifully slow way, building that rapport, slowly introducing new ideas. Same thing like with the Lucy story, slow and steady. And there's a writer whose name unfortunately escapes me, and he said that given the right amount of time, I can persuade you to do anything. I can even persuade you to get you to cut up your elderly parents and cook them in a stew. And this, despite the fact it's a horrible, horrible quote, this is exactly what this is all about. It's slow and it's very undetectable. And that's why for you and I sitting here, we think, well, how on earth did they convince someone to go to Syria and join ISIS? But we're not part of the process that got them there. So we don't see all that rapport and all that persuasive force that went into that story to get them out there. So you need that convincing story. You need that mice or rascals kind of focus so that you can persuade them without having to tell them the truth. The other thing that you see a lot is isolation happens. So again, with the Lucy situation, they isolated her very well from the rest of her company because they painted this story that the company was bad. The company did this horrible thing. You can't trust the company. But you see it in romance fraud as well. People isolating the victim from their friends, from their family. And the reason for that is that if I have fed you a beautifully convincing, persuasive story, and it's been beautifully crafted, and you've bought it, and you go and speak to your best friend, and your best friend who hasn't listened to the whole sort of rubbish that I've been spewing out and the rapport I've been building with you, might look at it and go, you know what, I think she's really dodgy. I really don't think you should speak to her. And that causes me, as the attacker, a bit of a problem. So the best thing I can do is from the very start, try and isolate you from the people who you're most likely to speak to, because then you do not have that sounding board anymore. We also want to have lots of reinforcement of different narratives. So in the Lucy case, they had newspapers, fake Peruvian newspapers that they sort of pointed her to try and confirm this story of whatever it was in the jungle. But we can see that a lot. It's not that difficult to create enough noise on the internet and then point people towards it and say, look, see, sources and facts, and this proves what I'm telling you. And if you do that well enough, it actually starts to look like you're telling the truth. And finally, we need an emotional connection with our victim as well, because emotions are really powerful and suppress our cognitive processes. But all of that's fairly sort of story-based, anecdotal evidence. There is some harder facts here, though, and I want to bring up. So MI5, who are the British intelligence, or one of the British intelligence agencies, they have come out publicly and said they are incredibly concerned with the number of fake social media accounts on professional social media that have been nefarious. And essentially, they have discovered that 10,000 UK government employees have been targeted and have engaged with accounts of concern. They haven't named LinkedIn, but it certainly does include LinkedIn. And obviously the name of the campaign is Think Before You Link. So I don't know. I'm not pointing fingers, but I think it's looking like LinkedIn is definitely one of the platforms that they're worried about. And these are just government employees in the UK. They're not, that's not even taking into account company employees in the UK. And the head of MI5 said that these individuals had been socially manipulated into some form of wrongdoing. And this has become a massive, massive concern. And it's become a concern for all of the countries within the Five Eyes community. And the UK CPNI have released this campaign and some rather disturbing videos. I recommend you go and watch them. I find them a little bit too dark personally, but maybe they'll hit the mark. But I think in the cyber community, we're all guilty of this, right? We all have seen a profile. So this is my genuine LinkedIn profile. But how many times have you looked at a LinkedIn profile and just done a cursory glance and thought, okay, there's a real photograph. Okay, she's put some sort of experience down, a couple of things. There's a company with a logo. You know, she has a few endorsements on her profile. There's a bit of activity. We might have some connections in common. Okay, I'll accept her request. I've done it. I'm sure most people honestly have done it. We don't actually know who's behind that account. Even if it looks really plausible, we don't know who's behind that account. So as cybersecurity professionals, I find we have a very international community and we talk a lot online. And I don't think we necessarily always practice what we preach. And that's fine. But what you have to appreciate is that once they're a connection, then they can message you. And once they can message you, they can build rapport. And once they've started to build rapport, you will not detect that it's happening to you. Psychologists have said that once the rapport building has started, it's almost impossible for the victim to detect that's what's going on. That has to happen prior to the rapport building starting. So it's something to think about, and definitely go and check out the UK CPNI website for the slightly disturbing videos and all the resources and data on that. But it's a concern, certainly in the United States. You guys have a lot of R&D being stolen by countries we won't mention, but we all know. And again, this is happening in Europe as well. So everyone has a button. You just need to find that button and push it. And this is something that, you know, I think people don't understand. This happens with people who recruit people into cults. It happens to people who get involved in romance fraud, in this kind of insider threat situation, that actually all of us have things we want, desire. We all have ambitions and fears, and I don't know, we all sort of have that massive political issue that you wish someone would just address and stop and block forever because it's like this horrible thing and you just wish it would go away. So we all have these things that we care about, and that essentially becomes buttons that can be pressed, things that can be used to build rapport with us. In fact, I read this really interesting psychological study where they said that people are even easier to profile when they're part of a group. So one of the examples that they used, and I do apologize if there's any people who fit this group in the audience, was CrossFit. So they said that CrossFit has a sort of almost cult-like following. Certainly it does in the UK. And people are really sort of into the whole, it's got a whole sort of vibe and everything, ethos and whatever. And that actually makes people who are in that community much easier to profile, much easier to build rapport with, because there's lots of things I can identify that you're interested in. I could even find other CrossFitters who I can befriend in order to get to you and have more credibility. You see the same with religion. Any sort of a group that has a really strong identity, being part of that makes you far easier to profile, which I think is really fascinating. Okay, so solutions. So for those of you who don't follow me online, I, as part of my hobbies, go and explore abandoned mines. So I do a lot of caving, climbing, things like that. And one of the things I love to do is to go and explore abandoned mines. And these mines are abandoned. No one looks after them. No one goes down there, checks on them. They're all crumbling and hugely dangerous, but sort of industrially beautiful, if you understand what that means. And one of the big issues that you have in these mines is something called false floors, which you can see here. And on this particular day, we were walking along a tunnel quite happily, chatting along, no issues at all. And we get to this junction and we see this. And instantly you think, okay, there is a floor with a massive hole in it. The floor, concrete, you can see looks incredibly thin. It's all collapsed through. It looks really dodgy. So you go and peer into the hole and you see this abyss that makes you feel sick to your stomach because it's just darkness. And you think, okay, we're in trouble. This is really unstable. We're walking along here. What do we do? There's a huge risk here, huge, huge risk. You're in the middle of nowhere, somewhere that is abandoned. No one else is in there with you. You have to deal with this situation. Now, you are never, ever getting that risk to zero. That's not going to happen. I'm never going to get to a point where I can do star jumps and burpees with no risk of falling through that. That's just simply not going to happen. But what I can do is use my harnesses, my ropes, my experience to get myself across there as safely as possible with the least amount of chance of death, right? And that doesn't sound brilliant, but it is, you know, the best outcome we can expect. And I might look at that and I might think, okay, I'm going to look at the floor. I'm going to look at the depth of the hole underneath it. How remote is this mine? You know, how long might it take someone to rescue me? What am I going to fall on? And all of these factors play into what I set up and how I get across that hole safely without it falling through, which I obviously did because I'm here presenting to you today. So why am I saying this? This is the same thing with these insider threats in social engineering. You are never, ever going to get that risk to zero. You're not going to get that risk close to zero. But what you can do is manage it just enough that it brings it down as much as you possibly can. And then the remaining risk you prepare for, if it was going to happen, how are we going to deal with it? And that's the same with cybersecurity, really. There's a lot of similarities between doing these risky activities like I do in my personal time and cybersecurity, because it's managing risk in a very sort of basic, crude, primal way, I suppose. So one of the things we can do is monitoring, and I'm sure most of you have had this flashing through your brains as we have been, as I've been presenting. Monitoring has many benefits. The downside to it is you can cause disgruntlement within your employees very, very quickly if you do this wrong. I had a client who told me that he was wondering whether he could put key loggers on the computers of all their staff when we had started the pandemic and turn their webcams on whenever he wanted. And I don't know how that would go down in the United States, but it would not go down well in the UK or Europe, I can tell you that. So we have to be really careful with monitoring. And one of the key things I think to keep remembering is a social engineer, an attacker, going after a member of staff to steal something of commercial value. Hopefully in your organization, not everyone will have access to that commercially sensitive information. So the monitoring, the main amount of monitoring that needs to really happen focuses on the people who have access to those sorts of sets of information, the commercially sensitive information, the IP, you know, the scientists who are working on the drug formula, that kind of thing. We don't need to monitor everyone to that level, because even if you were to socially engineer them in this capacity, they're not going to have the access. So we can limit it a lot. And I think what you don't want to do is cause a whole company full of disgruntled employees because you've been too aggressive with your monitoring. The next one is obviously training your herd. This is really important to recognize that this happens, and this is potentially nefarious activity when you're contacted online, in the same way that it is with all social engineering. To recognize that this might be a bit more complicated, that you might have a longer relationship with this person. But psychologists have realized that the best way to cause behavior change in a group of individuals, like in a company, is to give them this information about why it's scary, why it's, you know, why it's something to be worried about, why it's something to pay attention to. But equally importantly, then give them the tools to feel like in themselves they can manage this and that they can, you know, cope with it in some capacity. If you don't give them that self-efficacy, that ability to handle something, we have this feeling of hopelessness where we're sort of thinking, well, I know it's a risk, but I can't do anything about it, so I've just got to ignore it. So this is my friend Amy. I did ask her if I could use this photo, by the way, so I'm not just being mean to her. And Amy and I have had this conversation many times about how do you know when you're talking to somebody, because we have to talk to people we don't know. We have to talk to people we've only just met. How do you know that someone might not be legitimate, or someone, could just be a narcissistic person who you really don't want to get pulled into? But they could also be nefarious. And I've read lots of things that Chris has written on it, and I've done some thinking with some of the unsavory characters that I've come across. And some of the things that I said, I think, are sort of your detective work, if you like, or your canary tokens that you can set. Just think, do I like this person way more than I would normally like somebody? Do I feel, am I doing all the talking and they're doing all the listening? Because that's a bit of a red flag. Do they contact me all the time? Because Nina would text Lucy continuously every single day. Is it just too much? Does it not look like my normal relationship, and just get that canary token set for this doesn't quite feel how a relationship is supposed to feel? And my final point is that if it all goes wrong, if you fall through that false floor in your abandoned mind, you need to have redundancy in place. And this is my second space reference for those of you doing shots. And space industry is great for redundancy. They live it, they breathe it. They have triple redundant systems for absolutely everything. But it's a really important point. And certainly for people insiders who end up sabotaging an element of your company, having that redundancy in place, testing your crisis management plans and your ability to respond to a crisis is so, so crucial. I run crisis simulations for companies when I'm not doing these sorts of speaking engagements, and I always throw an insider threat element into them because they are notoriously difficult to handle. They are notoriously toxic to deal with in the media. And they're really good test of, if someone on the inside has taken something out of play, how do we keep operating as a business? So it's just having that last little bit of risk covered by, okay, let's plan for this, let's run exercises, let's make sure we are as prepared as we possibly can be. And on that joyful note, and a last mind picture, I think there's time for some questions.
Great job, Lisa. That was awesome. And you have a ton of questions. So let us get some. Here's our first one. When you were telling the story about the USB key, someone asked, even if the USB key did nothing, didn't it establish that semen was a tool that could be relied on to do malicious things in the future?
That's a really good point. I hadn't actually thought about it from that perspective, but you're right. Maybe it's a test. Maybe it's a test to see how compliant he would be and if he'd do it. So you're right.
Nice thinking there from that person, huh? This one, what about disposable insiders, as in ones being worked just to do a test in organization's defenses before investing resources and getting an insider with actual access to what you want?
Yeah, I think that possibly could work. I think it would depend on the company though, because a lot of companies so for example, pharmaceutical companies tend to be sort of world leaders in this space in terms of insider threats and what they know about them. And they will put a ton of different security controls in place for the people who have access to the good stuff. So I guess it could work. It would depend on how much extra sort of security was in place for the people with access.
Yeah, that's an interesting one too. Okay, here's one. Do you have any tips or resources for detecting when someone is trying to radicalize you?
Well, there's a lot of literature written on radicalization in the UK, and I'm afraid I don't know what the US has done in this respect. Maybe somebody else will know. If you look up it was called the Prevent program, And the Prevent program was a policing program. It was owned by the police back in the time I was there, that looked into radicalization and how it works and how to stop it. I think there are some behavioral science disciplines that have written quite extensively on it, and I'm sure that there's a lot of literature on how it happens, because this has been going on long before ISIS were around.
Yeah, that's a good point. Someone asked, how did you actually cross that hole?
Oh my God, it was a nightmare. It was an absolute nightmare. And I was not calm and composed, I can assure you. Lots of ropes, lots of belaying, lots of big, large rocks and things utilized to try and cross it very slowly. It didn't actually move as much as I thought it was going to. So that respect, it was better.
Yeah, that did not look like very safe at all in that picture.
No, I didn't show that one to my mum until she watches this video.
That's probably a good idea. Now when this comes out on the internet and your mom searches your name and she finds this speech, now she's gonna know and see that comment too. We're sorry, Mom. We're really sorry, Mom.
I'm really sorry, Mom.
Yeah, we're really sorry. First of all, I personally love the fact that you brought up pineapple pizza as being a detriment to life. I know we share that we are both Italian, and it is one of those things that people they tease me for all the time. And it's just disgusting. It's disgusting.
Is like, I am going to petition the UN to get it made into a war crime, but
yeah, I think it should be a war crime.
Yeah,
you know? I mean, considering that pineapple pizza was made by a Greek guy in Canada.
Oh my God, are you serious? I didn't even know that.
Yeah, I went as far as to find the history of pineapple pizza. It was made by a Greek guy who owned a pizzeria in Canada. Yeah, that tells you how non-authentic that is. Okay.
What are you doing, guys?
I know, terrible. But now let's talk about something serious, because we have a few minutes left before we end. And I want to talk about RISE. I want to talk about RIS, the respect and security, because this is something that myself personally and my company is supporting you in. First, just tell us what is it? What is RIS?
So Respect in Security basically is a group of 9 of us who co-founded it, and we essentially saw a lot of abuse and harassment that happened to men and women in the industry. And it was all very sort of hush-hush and behind closed doors. And we sort of wanted to create a situation where victims could go and get some help and get some sort of a way of bringing these people to account and holding them to account for some of the stuff that has gone on, but also a kind of way of bringing awareness about what's going on in our industry. And since we've launched, I've had so many messages from people, men and women, saying they've been so close to leaving the industry because it's just got so bad. So I think it's something that everyone should support, everyone should go and look at. There are personal sort of pledges that you won't partake in abusive behavior or conduct online. And then also companies can get involved and they can take the pledge and say that we do not tolerate abuse either to our own employees or by or perpetrated by our employees. And that's all on our website, which is respectinsecurity.org.
So let's ask the question that some people will have. So is this like a vigilante group where you're just trying to get these bullies people online and out them, and so they get embarrassed, or what? Like, really, what's the point?
So we don't want to have name and shaming situations going on. We're definitely not vigilante groups. What we're trying to do is get companies to say that if one of my members of staff engages in, let's just say, racist behavior online, this is an email address that we've put on our website. You can email it with your evidence of what this person has done to you, and we will look at it as a company and decide what to do. Yeah. And so that's all we're doing. We're not hunting people down. We're not encouraging vigilantism. All we want is a way that victims don't have to just sit in the silence and cry and, be traumatized by this stuff with nowhere to go.
Yeah. And if anyone thinks that it's gotten better, just look at the Blizzard case that literally just hit the news. people are still sexually harassing women and everyone in this industry, and thinking that it's funny and acceptable because nobody is stopping them around them. So it is time for something like this to actually be started, and that we should all be taking a part in it and supporting this effort. Um, Someone's asking, are there any plans for RIS to help with education?
So one thing we really want to do is do sort of like town hall type things where we hear from the community about what issues are going on and how we can address them. So I think over time, we only launched a couple of weeks ago, so we're very much in our infancy. We haven't even got our advisory board up together yet. But yeah, eventually all of this stuff is there. We've also got loads of resources on our website. If you are being harassed or abused in any capacity, there's lots of signposting on there about what you can do, where you can go, how you can collect evidence, etc., etc. And so that's what we aim to be, helpful from a signposting perspective as well.
And for me personally, just being friends with you and supporting this, I know that we've had this conversation, and it's more than just sexual harassment. It's bullying. It's just being a bully, and people can do that in this industry so much. And it's not about someone who's being a jerk and standing up for yourself. That's not it. It's like being a bully to the point where you're just trying to hurt someone else's reputation or career because they pose a threat to you. Of course, you said it, we're not a vigilante group, so we're not naming and shaming, but to me, a big indicator is if someone blocks the Rise accounts, that's a great indicator that they probably have the wrong mindset, and that they are in that category of being someone who can be a bully or a harasser.
Yeah. But go follow us on Twitter and go check our website out. Yeah. And any support is always welcome.
So check that out, folks, because you're gonna be hearing a lot more of it. Okay, with a couple minutes left, you actually have a few more questions that just came in. So what do you do if a coworker what do you do as a coworker if you suspect something isn't making sense with new behaviors?
Okay. So this was the research that I talked about in the presentation. That's on my website, red-goat.com. It's not behind any paywall or anything. You can just download it and read it. And it talks about how people don't report anything under any circumstances because we don't want to be seen as snitches. Yeah. So essentially, this research showed that if your boss or CEO was doing the most horrendous stuff that was so blatantly wrong, people still don't report them at all. You'll just stay quiet. Ideally, you would go and report them. But again, I think we've got a long way to go with company culture where you feel that you can do that without being branded a troublemaker. And that's the problem that unfortunately we found ourselves in. Yeah, good advice. And then last one, has there been any published work on black holing insider threat development in an organization? Pass. I'm afraid I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. I haven't heard anything.
If I find out, and this person, whoever asked the question, let yourself be known on social media, I will find out and I'll try and get you an answer. And somebody is trying to fight us, Lisa, on pineapple pizza, saying that everyone's No, we don't
wrong.
need to. We don't broadcast fake news, Chris. Don't give it airtime.
Okay.
Just don't give it airtime.
You're right. Anyone intelligent knows pineapple doesn't belong on pizza. So exactly. Yeah, I'm with you. Lisa, amazing job as always. I'm so glad you got to make it to SEVillage this year, and I can't wait to see more from you, from Rise, from everything that you're doing. So thanks for popping in and talking to us about this topic.
Thank you for having me.
Everyone, go check out Lisa on LinkedIn and on Twitter. She has a wonderful video podcast that you can watch. It's really great information, some really awesome guests on there. And there's just a lot of great information that she puts out.